Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay, here to talk a little bit about an event that occurred yesterday that was in the news, and that was Queen Elizabeth II's finally honoring her husband, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Yeah, I tried to do this video a lot, twice already, but it didn't come out to my satisfaction, so I'm doing it again. Yeah, the Duke of Edinburgh passed away April 9th, 2021. But, uh, but unfortunately, due to heavy COVID at that time, his family, the royal family, wasn't able to honor him sufficiently in the way they would want. So, coming up on the year anniversary of his passing, now they get to honor him. I learned a lot about him, just looking him up. I had no idea that he was a monarch in Denmark and a monarch as well as in Greece, and his family had actually escaped to Great Britain during the Greek Wars of Independence in the early part of the 20th century. Of course, Greece, a part of the Ottoman Empire for a while, but then Greece, one of the few places in the Ottoman Empire that became independent, before the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. After World War One, the Caliphate is finally done away with. All the Caliphate, because see, the Ottoman Empire inherits all the other caliphates that existed since the dawn of the Rashidun Caliphate. So when World War One ends in 1918, that's the end of the Caliphate. They had actually taken over Greece during their heavy reign and converted the Parthenon, which was a pagan temple, into a mosque. But I had no idea that he was Greek or Danish, but he was raised English. He talks about that in interviews where he didn't really consider himself Greek. He didn't consider himself an Orthodox Christian. He considered himself as a part of the Church of England. So, and he and Queen Elizabeth were married in 1952, exactly when Queen Elizabeth became the ruler of England, the monarch of England, the Queen of England, after the death of her father, King King Philip this I mean King George VII, the man who is featured in the movie The King's Speech. He passes away from cancer, and while she is on one of her royal tours around the various domains of the British Empire, she then gets word that her father has passed away. And interestingly enough, in the show The Queen, King Philip says to King Philip says to her, you know, now I see why your father smoked all those years because of the stress of this tour. I would have smoked too. She tries to get him to stop smoking. She says it's unhealthy, obviously because of her father, right? But he says, I see why he smoked all these years because these tours are freaking stressful. So he then says to her, what is it you want him to say? That finally he loves you more than he loves Margaret. Her sister is Margaret. And in the show, it's portrayed that Princess Margaret is somebody that the father actually, he says, yeah, he's fond of saying the same. Margaret, Elizabeth is my pride, but Margaret is my joy. So Elizabeth is going to be the one to inherit the throne, but Margaret is the one that he enjoys being around. She's the more fun one. As a matter of fact, when they go on tour, Margaret takes over, and even the British public is delighted by her. Her charisma. She should have. She's way more outspoken. She's better spoken than Queen Elizabeth, at least at first. In the early 1950s when Elizabeth assumes, control of Britain. So, but Elizabeth assumes control of Britain at a time when Britain is on the downfall. After World War II, we talked about it a lot in videos. Britain is becoming a country that is on the decline. As an empire, it's losing a lot of its colonies. India becoming independent in 1947, Israel becoming independent in 1948, various African countries becoming independent throughout the 1950s. So it is on the descendancy, as opposed to Queen Elizabeth I, who became queen in a very similar sort of way. In Queen Elizabeth I's case, her father, King Henry VIII, broke away from the Catholic Church in 1534 because the Catholic Pope, due to Catholic religious orthodoxy, not giving out divorces, breaks away from the Catholics. And what does he say? He says, "You either give me a divorce or give me an annulment, or I will break away from the Catholic Church," which is exactly what he does. But the irony of it was that before that, when the Reformation actually breaks out in the early 1500s, he is called by the Pope the defender of the faith, because other places like Switzerland, some people in France, some people in Spain, they're gravitating towards Protestantism because Protestantism is putting Christianity in the European vernaculars. It is taking it out of Latin. It is making it easier for the average individual to understand. And plus, it is putting the emphasis on, the biblical scriptures as opposed to extra added church traditions that the Catholic Church, later added on. Much is made up about the sale of indulgences, basically that the Catholic Church was selling tickets, and that's putting it rather simplistically, to heaven for sinners. But that is only one of the reasons why Martin Luther posts his 95 Theses on the wall of that Catholic Church in Germany and starts the Protestant movement. There are other reasons. A lot of these kings feel alienated from the Catholic Church. They also feel like they want to control their countries. They want a little bit more political autonomy that the Pope isn't giving to them. Because keep in mind, with the political fall of Rome in 476, there is a political ascendancy of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is controlling basically all these kings, and all these kings of these barbarians who become the later kings of places like in the Western Roman Empire, like Spain, like Britain, like France, especially France. They become like puppets or regents of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church has tremendous political dominance. So some of these princes want to assert their own identity and rights and break away from the centrality of the Catholic Church. So that is another reason why they revolt. Another reason is because of the invention of the printing press in the early 16th century with Johann Gutenberg. He invents the printing press, and it is now easier to print documents. Prior to that, you needed scribes to print out documents by hand, and it took years and years. But now you can print out things, movable type, the printing press, easily, and information is more accessible, kind of like with us in the late 20th century with the invention of the internet. It changed the way we saw the world. It changed the way we envisioned life to be. So that's why a lot of these Protestant kings are coming up. But King Henry VIII, Elizabeth The first, his father, is not like that. King Henry VIII is breaking away for his own personal reasons. So his version of the Church of England, when he founds the Church of England, it isn't so Catholic. It isn't so Protestant. It isn't that insistence on Protestant dogma like in other churches, for example, and other Protestant movements like the Calvinists, still kind of Catholic. But even though he doesn't, even though he later produces a male heir, he kills tons of his wives, including Catherine of Aragon, one of the Spanish queens that he marries, and Anne Boleyn. But he still doesn't have a male heir, and it is his female descendants, Queen Elizabeth I and Queen Mary I, who become the most successful and infamous of his two descendants, and they assume the throne. And it's under Queen Mary I, Queen Elizabeth I, that America gets to be explored. That she sends out feelers to the American continent to see how the British can expand their empire. Because keep in mind also at this time, the 15th century, 1492, there is the unification of Spain. Spain finally, had that long struggle, 700 years, some would say 800 years. Actually, the Muslims conquered in 711 AD. They conquer the Iberian Peninsula, and they hold on to the Iberian Peninsula until 1492. Finally, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon unite, and they expel the last of the Muslims. Now, Spain is looking to do something that Portugal under King Henry the Navigator had already done. Portugal under King Henry the Navigator had conquered the part of northern Morocco known as Ceuta and had created an overseas empire for the Spanish. So they're looking to do the same thing. They commissioned, of course, the Genoese sailor Christopher Columbus to do that, to gain access to the spices of India and China that European people had only heard about. European people had not, had access to the East. They had, but through the Muslims. Now they've have problems with the Muslims ever since 1099, the beginning of the First Crusade, but even more so now. They can't get through that old Silk Road overland beltway, so they're looking for faster access to the East for spices, particularly pepper, to preserve their food. Keep in mind there's no such thing as refrigeration. So Queen Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain sent out Christopher Columbus. He doesn't land upon Japan, China, or India. He instead lands upon the Caribbean islands, and Spain claims it all for themselves. Any other findings for themselves? Any other findings on the West? There is no claimant in the Spain for lands in the East, which Portugal is exploring. Keep in mind, like I said, Spain is one of those that stays loyal to the Catholic Church, not like England. Spain didn't break away from the Catholic Church. In fact, Spain is the representative of the Catholic Church against Protestant governments like England and Muslim governments like the Ottomans. So, Spain having a dispute with their brother kingdom, Portugal, in 1493, they signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, which says that anything Portugal discovers in the east, they can lay claim to, and anything that Spain discovers in the west, including the Americas, they can lay claim to. So by the time Queen Elizabeth I ascends to the throne, America is completely controlled by Spain, and other countries see that Spain has conquered the Incas and they have conquered the Aztecs under Cortez and Pizarro, respectively, and they want a piece of that as well. They want a piece of that gold and that silver. So they say, okay, yeah, we got to get a piece of America too. So Queen Elizabeth I sends out these envoys to the Carolinas. So Sir Walter Raleigh in North Carolina and the Roanoke Colony, also, I mean, also in the Carolinas. You know, and it's kind of successful. It's not till James the First that England actually sets up an actual colony that is sustainable under King James the First. In 1607, they set up the Jamestown Colony, which becomes the first English colony, the ancestors to what would become the United States. Now, what happens with Queen Elizabeth I? So she's starting to found this empire. She's successful. She sends out not only Walter Raleigh, not only the Roanoke Colony. Walter Raleigh is somewhat successful, and the Roanoke Colony is totally unsuccessful. Nobody knows really what happened to the original Roanoke Colony. Some people think they were defeated by Native Americans. Some people think that they were eaten. But she's the Virgin Queen, Queen Elizabeth I. She doesn't get married, right? She doesn't have any heirs. So kind of like her father wanted male heirs. He founded his own churches because he couldn't have them. And the irony is the ones who carry on his legacy, his royal bloodline, is his female descendants, both his daughter Mary and his other daughter Elizabeth. Mary, she tries to bring the country back to Catholicism. She is unsuccessful. But with Elizabeth, she has this quasi empire now. She has seamen on the high seas, people robbing the Spanish. She's defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. You know, she has, but she has no heirs. She's the Virgin Queen. In fact, Virginia is named for her. So what do? The English crown now finally unites with the Scottish crown. For centuries, the Scottish crown and the English crown have been at odds with one another. In fact, today is the anniversary. Today, March the 30th, 1296 is the anniversary of the Siege of Bennickberg, when King Edward I invades Scotland. Scotland was an independent kingdom. Ever since the Romans, it had been an independent kingdom. England was Romanized. England was conquered by the Romans, Claudius, in 44 AD. But the Picts, aka the Scottish, were never conquered. The White Walkers on Game of Thrones are based on the Scottish Empire. Scots thought of themselves as independents. But during this time, in the early 1300s, Edward I sees that there is a succession issue in Scotland, because the Queen of Scotland is 9 years old and she is exiled to Norway. So he decides he's going to step in and take over Scotland. And put his own puppet king, John Balliol, in place of this little girl. Doesn't happen. The Scottish people are not having it. After the Siege of Bennickberg, in which he murders tons and tons of Scots, he earns the nickname the Hammer of Scotland. And this is kind of a throwback to earlier history, because the Romans, when they were there, they always wanted to take over the Scots too, but they couldn't because the Scots were too independent. The Scots were too rebellious and too rowdy, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't Romanize the Scots in the way that they could Romanize the English, the British, or the Britons. It was before the Anglo-Saxon invasions. So they really weren't called the English at that time. They were called the Britons. And they were Celtic too, like the Gauls in France, or like the Galatians in Spain, but they were Romanized. But they couldn't Romanize the Scots. And once again in history, they couldn't Englishize the Scots under Edward I. So, fast forward to the 1700s. It took a Scottish king to unite the crown of England and Scotland for the first time ever. Elizabeth I, no descendants, you know. So they have to bring in the Scottish king in order for the monarchy to continue. And they bring in the King James the Sixth of Scotland and King James the First of England. And he's the one that sets up the first permanent colony, both in in America in 1607 and in Ireland in 1610. He is also the one who writes the Protestant Bible. He translates the Bible finally for the first time, the permanent version of the Bible that we use today in English speaking countries, the King James Version, into from Latin into English. It had been translated by St. Jerome into Latin, the Vulgate Bible, and it had been translated a few times by people like John Wycliffe into English, but the standardized version that we use today was by King James the First of Scotland and England. So this relationship, this unification of the crown, then leads to a permanent unification in 1707 with the Acts of Union, and would eventually lead to Scottish Presbyterians settling the north of Ireland, and the troubles of the 1760s, 70s, uh, the 1970s and 80s, and the split between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. And England then after 1707, England has a new flag, the flag of St. George representing the English, and the flag of St. Andrew representing the Scottish. That's what you see today, the Union Jack. The cross of St. Andrew this way, which we copied in America as the Confederate flag, and the cross of St. George this way. The Scottish one is blue and white, and the English one is red and white. But now they're united, red, white, and blue. They're under the Union Jack in modern day. But the irony is that Prince Philip is the Duke of Edinburgh, and Edinburgh is Scotland. So basically, the Scots could never be conquered, and finally, when they were, it's because they wanted to be. But they always have, in history, asserted their differentiation from the English. As a matter of fact, during the 1630s, even though England was Protestant, King Charles I, he then tries to put the Scottish under his boots and make the Scottish church into more of the Anglican church, more Catholic like the Anglican church. And the Scottish Presbyterians, and they're not having it, man. They sign a covenant in blood saying that they will stick to their local traditions and they will remain Protestant. So they still want to remain independent. They still want to remain self-sufficient. They don't want to be taken over by the English. They still want to have their own identity religiously too. And they, unlike the English people, they take to Protestantism willingly. John Knox, this Scottish Calvinist, he's such a fervent preacher under Queen Mary the First of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scot. I mean, Queen Mary the Second, the Mary Queen of Scots. That she's actually scared that he will lead in a rebellion to overthrow her. So in both instances, under Charles the First and Queen Mary the Second, uh, they're scared because the Protestantism in the Scottish people is so fervent and so independent. They are led by their kirks. They are led by their tribal leaders, just like they were in the past when they were part of paganism. They couldn't be conquered by the Romans. They couldn't be conquered by the English under Scottish, under Edward the First, and they could not be conquered by the church authorities, either a Catholic, Mary the Second, or even a Protestant Anglican like Charles the First. So they have that independent spirit. As a matter of fact, even in America, Most of the descendants of the revolutionaries that rebelled against the British Crown in 1776 were of Scottish descent, especially in the Appalachia region, the Battle of Kings Mountain. They've always been a really rebellious, cantankerous people for rulers and governments. So that is the legacy of Edinburgh, the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, um, and the legacy of Scotland and Scots Irish. Of course, we know we talked about the wars in the 1690s between King James II and William of Orange, in which King James II tries to lead a French invasion of England, and the Protestants aren't having it. They want to still remain Protestant, so they call in the Dutch king, King William of Orange, and he defeats them in the Battle of Bayonne, and Protestantism remains in England. So you have this war in the British Isles, differently than the war, like the 30 Years' War on the mainland of England, the mainland of Europe, but it's still kind of the same. Protestants versus Catholics, kind of like what we see today with the Shia religion. And I do compare it to the Shia religion, the Shia Sunni split, because like the Shia Sunni split, you have the Persians. The Persians were an independent people. They were their own culture. They had several dynasties. They had the Achaemenid dynasty under Cyrus the Great. They had the Sassanid dynasty before Islam. And they also had the Pahlavi dynasty under the Romans. Each and every time, they would not also, they were like the Eastern version of the Scots. Each and every time in history, they would never be conquered, and they were fiercely independent. Finally, when they were conquered with the spread of Islam in the 7th century, they um, adopt Shia Islam. They identify within their culture, they identify within their historical narrative with the persecution of Ali's followers. And they identify with the family of the Prophet Muhammad, the Akhli Bayt, and Muhammad's grandson, Hussein. So they see themselves in the prism of that narrative, and they begin to assert their identity and rights. And they're the only Arab country conquered from either the Sassanid Empire or the Byzantine Greek Empire that doesn't actually speak Arabic, besides the Turks, but the Turks came in later. So just like with the Scots, yeah, they're going to be part of you, but they're going to be part of you on their own terms, and they're going to assert their identity, and they're going to assert their differentiation in religion. Yeah, the Persians are like, yeah, we're going to be Muslim, but we're going to speak Farsi number one, and we're going to be Shia number two. Because even before they officially adopt the Shia version of Islam under the Safavid Empire in the 1600s, in contrast to the Ottoman Empire, which is in the West, Shiaism still grows there. The Battle of Karbala happened right there in Baghdad. So certain groups use religion, my point is, to differentiate between themselves and other groups. Just like African Americans. African Americans here in the early 1900s, they began to convert to Islam, and they start to use the new Islamic identity as they see it, especially after the fall, or after, not the fall, but the disorganization of the Black Star Liner mission and the UNIA of Marcus Garvey. They start to recuperate the Black nationalist movement under a religious guise and use the religion of Islam as they understand it, with the Moorish Science Temple and with the Nation of Islam in the 20s and 30s. They use religion to differentiate themselves from white Americans. It's not the only way they do it. They do it through hairstyles as well, like the afro, for example, but religion is one of the primary ways they do it. And with the 5%, it goes even further because in the 1960s, because it eliminates the hierarchy, just like the Scottish Presbyterians eliminate the hierarchy in that. In the English church, there's a hierarchy. There's still priests, there's still bishops. It's kind of like the Catholic Church, except without the Pope in Rome, instead, the British monarch in the head of it. Well, the Presbyterians eliminate that. No hierarchy. Anybody could be a preacher. Anybody feeling the Holy Spirit. They democratize it. Likewise, with the 5%ers, they democratize Islam. Not only now, in this version of Islam, is there no ulama and there's no Islamic scholars, but there is no even, clergy. Everyone is a god. Everyone is their own autonomous person. When Clarence 13X was assassinated in 1969 in Martin Luther King Project, he says anybody can be like me. There's no speciality in me. We can all be that. And under his nine born, that movement begins to grow. So I find it interesting that the democratization of the Scottish and the rebelliousness of the Scottish and later the Scots-Irish begins to inspire the American Revolution and begins to inspire even the rebelliousness of centrality that we saw in the Civil War. You could debate, the merits of the Civil War, why they rebelled, or were they just fighting for the aristocracy. Evidence suggests that they probably were doing that, but their rebelliousness, their ancestors, the Scots and the Scots-Irish, had always fought against the centrality of leaders and the centrality of the importance of centralized government. They never agreed with centralized government ever. So they applied that same mentality to America, and applying that same mentality to America in the political secular realm, you wouldn't agree with centralized government ever. You would say that you have a distaste for centralized government, just like the 5%ers had a distaste for centralized government. So here you have the Queen. You have the Queen. She's a centralized figure, but the Scots never agreed with her. They never co-signed centrality of government, and they didn't in America either. I found it interesting that when that American spirit is then applied to Islam, it becomes less centralized even then. You know what I mean? The American spirit is rebelliousness. The American spirit is decentralization. The American spirit is innovation. So just as the Persians took Islam and they Persianized and they made it more hierarchical, it could be argued in the Shia tradition. The Shia tradition is way more hierarchical than the Sunni tradition, with chosen imams, either the sixth imam, like the Ismailis, or the seventh imam. They made it more hierarchical. The British, when they took over, and they made their Protestant movement, their Protestant Reformation, it was still hierarchical. But when the Scottish took over the Protestant, and they had their Reformation, and they made their own Protestant church, and they nationalized it, it was non-hierarchical. So likewise, they did the same thing in government with America. They made American government non-hierarchical. So they're rebellious against centralized government. There is a narrative in the Civil War, if you take the slave narrative out of it and you consider, what was another reason why the southern states rebelled against the North? The main reason was slavery, but another reason was the North was very hierarchical and the South was not so much hierarchical, at least among the yeoman farmers. You could say, they just wanted to supplant, English aristocracy onto the southern planters, and that is true, and replace the English lower classes with African slaves. That's kind of true, but it is also not so true. You know what I mean? Because among the yeoman farmers and among the people like the Appalachians that were heavily descendants of Scots Irish and not the heavy descendants of the Cavaliers, the Royalists, uh, because at one point this Protestant movement became so fervent in England that there was an English Civil War in which you had the parliamentarians, that was basically the descendants of the fanatical Protestants like the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and you had the Royalists. And a lot of the Royalists who lost, they moved to America, and they became the descendants of the Southern aristocracy. But the others who wouldn't have agreed with the Royalists anyway, because again, no kings, no masters, they went to America. So that kind of rebellious spirit against centralized government carried over to the Americas. So by the time you get to the 60s and you get Islam, what if you're going to have an American version of Islam? It's going to be Americanized. It's going to be decentralized, just like the American spirit is to be decentralized. The American spirit is to be rebellious, both from the perspective of the African slaves, the African Americans, and the perspective of the Scottish Irish, which who predominated in that part of North America, especially the South. You have this rebellious spirit, this spirit against centralized government. Now, it could be kind of a stretch to say, well, how they influence each other when, um, the Scots Irish, the poor people, were really antagonistic towards black people and racist and white supremacists. Well, by symbiosis, just by being next to someone, you adopt their spirit. If the African Americans began to be acculturated into America, they understood that America was anti hierarchical. In a sense, there is a strain of American nationalism in American culture that is very anti hierarchical, just as there is a strain of American culture that is hierarchical, that is about centralized authority, especially in the Northeast. But in the South, they were always against that. They were for tradition heavily. They were for biblical tradition, sola scriptura. They were involved with the Protestant Reformation. Sure enough, the Scottish chose the Protestant Reformation. They led the Protestant Reformation. They were Calvinists, but they had that rebellious spirit when it came to government. So that was a strain that carried over in the South. And remember, African Americans primarily, the culture that they began to develop was primarily of a Southern culture. So by the time in the 1920s and 30s they moved to the North, what they have culturally is that same rebellious Scots Irish or Scots lowland culture that was antagonistic toward the English aristocrats, both in ancient times and in modern times. You know what I mean? In ancient times, the Scots were not conquered by the Britanized or the Romanized Britons or the Romans, their overlords. They were not conquered by the English under Edward the First, and they were not conquered by the Anglicans religiously. And when they did join forces, it was under their own terms. A Scottish king became English. So, and they were not going to be conquered again by America. In America, they were not going to be taken over by the British and divulged into tyranny with America. So their descendants become a separate country. And they set up that independent spirit in the South that transposes to African Americans. And by the time African Americans reached the North, they began to develop new religious ideas to differentiate themselves from white Americans, much like the Scottish did in England. But they also have that rebellious spirit. No, we ain't gonna listen to no sheikh or no ulama. in the same way that the traditional Sunni Muslims were. We're going to tap into our own pre-existing European culture and our American experience of rebelliousness against the centralization of authority. So I find that interesting that King Philip the First, King Philip, excuse me, Prince Philip rather, represents Scotland in a sense, and Scotland is so rebelliousness and the rebellious spirit of the Scottish people was so embedded into America that it even was transposed onto other peoples that either came into America later, like the Italians or the Irish Catholics or the Polish people and even African Americans. That Scottish spirit of rebellion was transposed into every facet of American life. It's almost like we as Americans are the children of the Scottish in many ways, which brings me to another point. Tomorrow, March the 31st, is the anniversary, or is the day that we celebrate this a special man in American history, and that special man embodies the rebellious spirit of groups like the Five Percenters, the rebellious spirit of groups like the Scottish Presbyterians, the rebellious spirit of the American Revolutionaries, carries on that rebellious spirit also, and is part of that American tradition because of his rebellious spirit, and that is Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez was a commentator, a political activist, a fighter for the rights of farm workers, Chicano farm workers in the north of California, and took from the Mexican tradition of the Aztecs and the Mexican tradition of Catholicism, Spanish Catholicism, took that, but also the American tradition of rebellion and organized civil rights expeditions to civil rights expeditions and walks throughout the north of California. At this time, African Americans were rising up, they were ending Jim Crow, and he took cues from that and he began to develop the Chicano movement and the United Farm Workers movement. But again, that rebellious spirit. You notice that when every civil rights leader, conscious leader, what have you, draws on the spirit of rebellion, they always appeal to the rebellious spirit of America. Well, where is that rebellious spirit of America born from? It is born from, I believe, my opinion, the Scots. The, the, the rebellious spirit of the Scottish people and the rebellious spirit of the African American people. Those two groups. It is those two groups that inspire the rebellious spirit, the rebellious strain of, of American activism. The Scots would not be subdued in any way. The African Americans would get came up in the South that was surrounded by Irish Scottish culture would not be subdued either. You know? So when other groups began to see that, like the Puerto Ricans in Chicago, like the Puerto Ricans even in New York, or like Cesar Chavez and the Chicano activists, they began to want to copy that and they began to want to rise up against that. And Cesar Chavez uses the ideas that of Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King, and he of nonviolence, of ahimsa. But where does Mahatma Gandhi get it from? Mahatma Gandhi, even though he was inspired by Jainism and ahimsa and nonviolence, but the spirit of protest is something that he draws directly from the English and Scottish traditions of protest. People might say that is crazy. What does Mahatma Gandhi really have to do with Cesar Chavez? Or what does um, that in turn have to do with Scottish Presbyterianism or the Scottish Reformation or the Scottish unwillingness to yield, like William Wallace, to English rule? Or what does that have to do with Prince Philip, um, the the Duke of Edinburgh? That my point is that in the trajectory of English civilization, in the trajectory of what is Anglo and Anglo-American civilization, the first rebels were the Scots. They refused to bow to the Romans. They refused to bow to the English. They refused to bow to the Anglicans. They refused to bow to the British again in the American Revolution. They refused to bow to the centralized governments of the North. They refused to bow to, during the American Civil War. They refused to bow to cultural norms today. They're a very cantankerous people, much like, again, I compare them to the Persians. Persians refused to bow to Sunni hegemony. So that rebellious spirit of the Scots and the Scots-Irish is then transposed onto other groups, African Americans who revolt against slavery. Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, using their own, of course, religious traditions of Christianity. Christianity is asserting its identity and rights, and that is transposed, and that spirit of rebellion is then migrated to Cesar Chavez and to the civil rights leaders of the 1960s and 70s that were Hispanic and Chicano. Because we still have it in America. We still have this idea in America that of rebellion, this idea that we're not going to submit to authority. And where does this idea come from? In all forms and iterations, I would argue that this idea comes from the Scots. The Scots were the first people that the English tried to conquer. The Scots were the first people, the Siege of Bennickberg, that the English tried to take over. They were the beginning seeds of the English, what would become the English/British Empire. They were the first rebels. It is their rebellious spirit that was then put onto America. And in almost every rebellion that we've ever seen, their spirit influences everything. It is no coincidence that more rebellions happen as far as the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world. More rebellions happen as a result of the more the more Scottish and Scots-Irish influence South than did the Anglican influence Caribbean. Yes, there were a lot of rebellions in the Caribbean. I'm not saying that there weren't, but there were way more rebellions that we know about, and way more slaughterings that we know about, of these evil white supremacist slave owners in the South, where there was that rebellious spirit than there was in the West Indies, where they were more Anglican. So I believe that the center spirit carried over even to the slaves, and even to the descendants of African Americans who then brought it to the North and West and influenced Chicanos and influenced other groups to do the exact same thing in the North and West. Now you could say, well, African American conscious groups that were rebel groups like the Nation of Islam or like the Five Percenters, became so anti-hierarchical, so rebellious against social norms that they got into crime and stuff like that, or that's true, or that symbols of Scottish independence and symbols of Scottish pride were misappropriated by racist and white supremacist groups, in the South, like the KKK. But everything about the Scottish rebellion and the Scottish Kirk and the Scottish tradition anti-hierarchicalism wasn't always about the KKK, right? And everything about the five percenters and everything about this assertion of African American identity and rights wasn't always about the Supreme Team or drug dealing or anything like that, or being an oppressor, as it were. There are always phonies in a movement too. There are real people and there are phonies. There are people who will misuse certain movements and certain organizations for their own, material gain, even with so-called gangs and factions like that, even with religions. We see that in the Persian spirit of rebellion, even in Iran, whether it be the Republic of Iran and the Islamic Revolution of 1979, or the um, rise of the Taliban, both times in 1996 as well as 2020, 2021. So you can misuse any movement, but that doesn't take away from the merits of the movement. That doesn't take away from the righteousness of the movement. The movement is still righteous, even though, some of the people in the movement were not so righteous. Some of the people, of course, in the 5% movement and then the Nation of Islam and all those pseudo Islamic groups or Islamic inspired groups that grew up in the North and Midwest. Of course, they weren't all, righteous, but some of them were righteous. And still, even the unrighteous part is still part of their, still part of the heritage and the history of rebellious movements in America. People are going to say, well, weren't weren't the abolitionists in the North, say in the 19th century, weren't they also inspired by the Protestant Reformation? Yeah, they were too. What we were seeing with the Great Awakening in the 19th century was just like what we were seeing with the original Great Awakening in the 18th century, was a renewal of that Protestant ethic, a renewal of that Protestant belief that we got to expunge um, the corruptness of a movement. We have to decentralize. We have to reevaluate. That was what was birthed out of the Second Great Awakening, the abolitionist movement. What was birthed out of the First Great Awakening, the American Revolution. Again, the Scottish ideas of independence, the Scottish ideas of rebellion, the Scottish ideas of nonconformity carries over in all the centuries, really, and carries over into other ethnic groups that are not of Scottish descent. Maybe the Irish independence movement, the Puerto Rican independence movement, the Chicano movement, and the African American movement. I believe, that's my opinion. They may draw on other influences, like, for example, the Moorish symbol draws on the Moors, right? They draw on the medieval Moors, the legacy of the medieval Moors, who basically conquered all of Spain and could have conquered France were it not for Charles Martel, the ancestor of Charlemagne. Or, for example, say, groups might draw on the Asiatic history, like the tribe of Shabazz, like the Nation of Islam. But still, they're still drawing, whether they know it or not, consciously, they're still drawing on that well of Scottish and Scots-Irish rebelliousness. No, I won't be put down. I won't be derided. I won't be culturally assimilated because you tell me to be culturally assimilated. I'm going to fight. I'm going to be born fighting. No gods, no masters. And how does this relate to Prince Philip? Well, there are people in Prince Philip's own family, like Meghan Markle, that have that American tradition. Even though he says he represents the Duke of Edinburgh and the capital of Scotland, he represents the spirit of Scottish rebellion. Not really, only in name only. I think Meghan Markle represents that spirit of Scottish rebellion that is such a carryover into American culture. Because if you look at it, take all the Anglosphere, right? all of the white settler communities that came into different places, like New Zealand, for example, like Australia, or like America. America is the only one that revolted violently against the British. You know, America is the only one, and America was primarily settled by Scots Irish, the same rebellious people. And it was strongest in the spirit of rebellion was strongest in the South, just like the spirit of rebellion of the slave was strongest in the South. You know, amongst them, the greatest rebellions happened in the South because compared to the West Indies, and this is where people were part of those Protestant movements that came out of the Scottish Presbyterian movement. You know, not directly, but ideologically, they were descendants of the Scottish Presbyterian movements, like the Methodists from England or the Baptists from Germany. You know, they their ideology was transposed and transformed by the spirit of rebellion of the Scottish Kirks, I believe, which itself is a carryover to before Protestantism even existed, or before Christianity even was a part of the Scots. Remember, the Scots were never conformed to the Christianity of Constantine. The English were, the British were, not the Scots. The British, they went along to get along, and that is more of the spirit that informs countries like Australia, New Zealand, but the spirit that informs America in all its facets, whether it's Cesar Chavez, whether it's Martin Luther King, whether it's the Black Panthers, whether it's Malcolm X. The spirit that informs them all is the spirit that I will not be dominated. I will not yield the knee to you. And that is more an embodiment of Meghan Markle, I feel, than an embodiment of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. That is more an embodiment of DMX, who passed away the same day, April the 9th, as the Duke of Edinburgh. He's a rebellious person. He was bringing back hardcore hip-hop after the scare of the death of Biggie and Tupac. Everybody was scared. Everybody was conforming. Again, that conformist spirit, just like the conformist spirit of the English, or the conformist spirit of the aristocratic slave owners, the Cavaliers. That conformist spirit, taking away that conformist spirit of, okay, we're going to play by the rules. We're going to do nice. We're going to do the shiny suit era. And we're putting on a rebellious spirit of gangsterness, streetness, and what many will perceive as antisocial behavior. But it really is an antisocial behavior if you really look at it, because when the English first came into the Scottish lowlands, or the Romans first came into the Scottish lowlands, they kind of probably looked at the Picts or the Chalcedonians as antisocial behavior, like a lot of modern critics looked at hardcore rap or the gangster rap. Think about it. Or how people looked at William Wallace, or people looked at Cesar Chavez, or people looked at the 5%ers. Oh, he's calling himself God. What? He can't be calling himself God. He can't be assuming the mantle of divinity, because of his race and because of how he was the downtrodden. Think of how the way that the English settlers in the South, the upper class of the South, tried to transpose their rule on not only the African Americans, but also the yeoman farmers. You must say, well, that doesn't make any sense. The yeoman farmers, the poor ones, right, the ones that had Andrew Jackson as their leader, right? Andrew Jackson is Scots Irish descendants. They were the ones that brutalized the Native Americans. They were the ones that fought on the side of the Confederacy. Well, weren't they kowtowing then to the aristocracy? Maybe. Absolutely they were. But it was the aristocracy making them fight. As the saying goes in the Civil War, rich man's war, poor man's fight. They were only fighting because They were being forced to fight, or they were brainwashed under the illusion of white supremacy that they through their oppression of black people in the South, they could themselves gain a leg up in the system of white supremacy. But they were in England back home, they were brutalized too, and they still had that rebellious spirit. But they were convinced and they were hoodwinked that the people oppressing them were the northern elites, the New Englanders, and not the southern aristocracy, the people that had been oppressing them back in England, the Cavalier class, the royalist class. So that rebellion was misguided. That rebellion was not good, but people can be misguided. But still, I think the rebelliousness of the South, the nonconformity of the South that epitomizes American culture right now, and that was transposed onto other people. Because who are the ones in American history that are the arbiters, are the guardians, are the gatekeepers, if you will, of American Southern culture? Is African Americans. They're the ones who brought the Southern way of life, the Southern mentality of nonconformism to the North. The nonconformity to social norms of combined with social conservatism and a decentralization of religion, an overly religiosity, but a nonconformist attitude to political correctness that was brought to the North, that was introduced into the South by the Scottish and Scotch-Irish yeomen, but that was brought to the North by African Americans. Of course, informed by their unique position um, as an oppressed group, that's no doubt, but also influenced by the Irish, influenced by the Scottish Irish culture of rebellion. They brought that to the North and West, and that, of course, influenced the Chicanos, who also were in a similar position after the Mexican American War of 1848. So it's interesting that although the Duke of Edinburgh was not English, he was Danish and Greek, he still represents somehow England. And although Meghan Markle was not there and she is kept out of the festivities because of the ideological war, if you will, between um, herself, between her American spirit, her American unwillingness to submit, and her race, being that she's black. She's the true embodiment of what it means of individual rights and anti-hierarchicalism and that rebellious spirit that inspired not only the Scottish revolts, not only the peasant revolts in England, not only the spirit of Runnymede in 1215. She is the embodiment of American individualism that the Scots brought here and that they introduced to other groups in the South, that those groups, especially African Americans, then brought to the North and the West, that influenced Cesar Chavez. So in a way, in a weird way, there is a link between William Wallace, there is a link between Robert de Bruce, and there is a link between Cesar Chavez and Meghan Markle and gangster rap and DMX. It is a link that I just made up, but I call it the Scottish, Irish / African American / all over American spirit of rebelliousness and nonconformity. And in that could be the spirit of Selena Quintanilla, who um, is also March the 31st. Tomorrow is a day of mourning for her as well, because she passed away in 1995 as a result of the assassination at the hands of Yolanda Saldivar. She also has a nonconformist spirit, and I think her spirit is the spirit of Queen Elizabeth I in an ironic way. Because what does she do? Just like Queen Elizabeth I broke through in a male dominated British aristocracy, no males, you only want males to be the face of it. You have Selena Quintanilla, or Selena the first, Selena the first, if we include Selena Gomez, breaking through that male-dominated business of the Tejano music scene and revolutionizing the world and really introducing the world really to Mexican American culture and the Tejano culture, which the Tejano culture is not only influenced by Mexican American culture and of course Spanish culture, but is also influenced again by the Scottish idea of the Scottish Kirks and the Scottish rebellions, because a lot of Scots Irish from Appalachia and a lot of African Americans from the East settled in Texas as well, and that informed the Texas Revolution. Remember, Texas revolted first, you know, against the centrality of Mexico and Santa Anna. It wasn't that the United States came in and tried to take over Texas. No, the Texans, both the gringos, the Americans, and the Tejanos, like Juan Seguin, both of them, were tired of Mexican rule. Both of them wanted to rebel against the centrality of the Mexican government, and that's exactly what they did. And that is the history of the Tejano culture and the Tejano movement, epitomized by the music of Selena Quintanilla. So just like the Chicanos on the West Coast were influenced by that idea of Scottish independence and that idea of Scottish rebellionism, so too was Selena. And it's interesting too that April 9th ties into this, because April 9th is the anniversary of two things: the end of the Civil War, the treaty, um, the Peace at Appomattox, the famous shaking of the hands of Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, as well as the anniversary of the death of Prince Philip, and the anniversary also of the death of passing of DMX, but also um, um, is the anniversary of the invasion and the conquest of Iraq. Now, you could say maybe the Iraqis have a spirit of rebellion from the Scots Irish or William Wallace or any of that, but I don't think so. I think it's a parallel line, but the Iraqi rebellion comes from the Persian reassertion of culture that is embodied in the Shia tradition. So there's two parallel lines, Shia and Sunni, which looked at on a macro level is really Arab and all simplistically, but is really from a microcosm level, it's kind of looked at as a culture clash between the downtrodden Persians who see themselves in the story of Ali and Hussein and the Sunni hegemony. So just they rebelled against the Sunnis, of course. Later on, after the conquest of Baghdad and the fall of Saddam Hussein's statue, they later rebelled against the Americans as well. The anti-imperialistic spirit, that anti-colonial spirit that the Shias have, just like the Sunnis have. You know, I'm just like the Scots Irish have, just like the Scots and the Scots Irish have as well. That's pretty weird, that it happens in the far eastern half of what was the Western world, and in the far western half of what is the Western world, the exact same thing. Um, the Persians have the exact same fighting spirit that the Scots Irish have, in a sense. They will not be dominated, they will not be taken over, and they will not be relegated to second class position. And you see that a lot in Texas culture, the Tejano culture that Selena embodied. of that resistance of conformity. So you see, just as in the Shias of Iraq, who overtook Saddam Hussein, who oppressed them basically when he was in power, and his Ba'athist spirit, his Arab supremacist spirit, is is disregarded with the Shias as well. You know what I mean? So that's a really long rant. I tried to tie in a bunch of stuff. Tied in um, Scottish Scottish independence, the independent mindset of the Scottish and the Scots-Irish, which was transposed into America in all facets. And I kind of paralleled it with the Persian Renaissance and the Renaissance of Persian culture and the resistance that the Persians had to Sunni/Arab hegemony, which carries over into April the 9th, the fall of Saddam Hussein. Anyway, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the bell button. See my next video is coming out. Love y'all.